lands our campus is on today. The Charan Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattapane, Monacan, Nansman, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattapane, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respects to their tribal members past and present. Before we, as I mentioned, we welcome you again. We realize that tonight, this evening rather, I'm quite sure you've all witnessed the recent developments of the verdict that was read regarding the trial on the murder of George Floyd. And we just want to say that we stand in solidarity with the family as we recognize that even amidst this victory in court, there are still emotions, real emotions that are tied to this very historic case. And we hope and we extend and we hope to see this trend of justice for all oppressed people as we move forward. Um, since our last workshop in February, I've connected with some of you who've either started your genealogy research project or you're building on your research. And I'm excited for you to have you as a part of our genealogy research community. And I encourage you to stay along because after this program, we'll also give some upcoming announcements regarding the genealogy workshops to be held this summer. And so I encourage you on tonight to submit your questions in the chat, and we will ensure that they are answered. We'll also periodically place links in the chat on information that you may find helpful. We also, I'm quite sure, have some experienced genealogists in the audience. And so feel free to post about any upcoming events or any other helpful resources. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest for tonight. We have a great workshop in store for you today with Hannah Scruggs and Lisa Crawley of the Robert F. Smith Explore Your Family History Center with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The workshop tonight is taking a closer look at genealogy records. The History Center at the, I'm sorry, Hannah Scruggs, she is a genealogy reference assistant at the History Center at the National Museum of Genealogy, National Museum of African American History and Culture. A native of Central Virginia, Hannah graduated with an MA in Public History from North Carolina State University, a BA in History from William & Mary. So she's a William & Mary alum, and we're happy to have her here. Her research and professional interests include slavery, descendant communities, and African American environmental history. Lisa Crawley is a genealogy reference assistant as well. She has served as the resource manager of the Reginald F. Lewis Museum in Baltimore and as the administrator at the Montgomery County Historical Society in Rockville. A native of Elizabeth, New Jersey, her research interests include antebellum era African American slavery, African American history of the Mid-Atlantic and Upper South, and Methodist history. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics from Drew University and an MA in Museum Studies from Hampton University. Let's give our guest presenters tonight a virtual applause. And now I turn it into their hands.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us and coming out to support us and also the Lemon Project this evening. We're really excited to be here. As Jajuan said, I'm an alum, and so it's especially exciting. And we have a presentation about taking a closer look at census documents. We know that the census is an extremely important document for genealogists, for anyone doing family or community history research. And we just wanted to take some time to go over some of the parts of the census that we can miss and to dig deeper into the census to see exactly what we can learn. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. And there we go. All right, so we're going to take a closer look at Genealogy Records, the U.S. Census Edition. So we're going to go through and talk about census gems by the decades. We'll talk about using slave schedules, and we'll share some census tips and tricks. We'll be using examples from our own research and the research of those that we know and that we've assisted with, because we've been lucky to see a whole lot of really interesting things on the census, and we're excited to share some of them with you and what we've learned from them. So the US Federal Census, as I said earlier, is one of the most important documents for genealogical research. It's helpful, right, because it happens every 10 years since 1790 and is required by the Constitution. For African American genealogy, we know that most of our ancestors appear between 1870 and 1940, though free Black heads of households do appear on every census. So we will be talking about the censuses prior to 1870 as well. And now we know that the censuses are released 72 years after they're taken to the public to protect privacy. And so we have a picture here of an 1810 census of Northumberland County, Virginia, with Charles, who's listed as a free Negro. So we're all very excited, I'm sure, about the release of the 1950 census that will be happening in 2022 on April 1st. So just under a year from now, everyone get ready. It will be available online, though it won't be fully indexed at that time. At the end, we have some resources about searching for using the 1950 census to search as soon as it comes online. So we hope that you'll take a look at those and check those out. And we noted that in prior years, crashes have happened on these genealogy sites because people do get really excited. The release of the census, we haven't had one since 2012. It's going to be very exciting. So to get started, we'll talk about the 1940 census to dig in. The 1940 census lists all household members with their relationship to the head of the household, where they lived in 1935, everyone's occupation. If they lived in a city, their street name will be listed on the left column, and the informant may be indicated by a circle with a plus sign. The 1940 census is the most recent census we have access to, and it's often the place where we get started and where we encourage people to get started. We also get the birthplace of everyone in the household in the 1940 census, and we get some richer information as we'll get into the 1930, 1920, 1900. But this is a census that it's helpful for a lot of us to start at. When you're doing African American history, also this can be a really pivotal census because it is coming in the middle of the Great Migration. So when you're thinking about where your family was located at the time, if your family migrated north or west, this may be a census, it could go kind of either way, since it's right in the middle of the Great Migration. So it's an important starting place for so many of us in locating our families. For the 1930 census, we do get a bit more background information about the family. We get the birthplace of the parents of each person as well as their birthplace. We also get their age at first marriage. We learn if the family had a radio set. The technology questions on the census are extremely interesting, not just for what, the yes or no answer that they give the census taker, but it does say a lot about what's going on in the country at the time. Genealogy is, right, it's the study of our families. We do family history and community history research, and oftentimes we're focused locally, but the census is a good place to also see how national trends are playing out, and the types of questions that are being asked on the census reflect the national, what's going on, what people at the top of the federal government really want to know. So it's also interesting to think about those things in relationship to our families. They also ask about occupation, military service, and it asks if you are living on a farm. So the questions here, again, we're 10 years out from 1940. We get a little bit more information about the birthplace of the parents, which is often helpful for African American history, especially if your family has migrated. It gives you another key to searching for families and where you're going to go next. So we've grouped the 1920 and the 1920, 1910, and 1900 censuses together. The things that we look for and focus on in these censuses are the country and the birthplace of the parents. The 1920 census asks about mother tongue. In all of these censuses, we get questions about naturalization and citizenship. This is a time of heavy immigration into the United States. And again, what's going on nationally is going to inform what the census is asking of citizens. For 1910, we also get the month and year of the birth, the number of years married for each couple. That helps us figure out if there's a marriage certificate, when that may be found. We also have the questions in 1910 and 1900, mother to how many and how many are living, which is of course a very poignant column, 2 columns on the census. And we can learn more information about our families that way, especially if that's something that, loss of children is something that our families haven't talked about. And then the 1910 census also IDs Civil War veterans with the CU, CA, UA, or UN, right? Yes. Yeah, Confederate CN, sorry, CN or CA, and then UN and UA for Army and Navy. So that's another column that can tell us about our ancestors, especially if we have ancestors that served in the USCT. That is a column that we want to look at and pay attention to. So the 1890 census, as we all know, or as many of us know, I shouldn't make that assumption, but as many of us know, was burned in a fire in 1921, 100 years ago. And most of it was destroyed in the basement of Commerce Building. We have this meme to illustrate what happened in that situation. The 1880 and the 1870 censuses are extremely pivotal and important for doing African American genealogy. The 1880 census is going to be the first census where you see the relationship to the head of the household, and it's also going to be the first census where you see the birthplace of the parents. If the person in the household was born in 1880, you'll also see a birth month for them. The 1870 census is the first census where most African Americans appear for the first time, and is a very important place to look for those familial connections in neighbors and to identify potential enslaving families. 3 columns that I find extremely interesting, that we find extremely interesting and point out when we're working with folks in the 1870 census is going to be the real estate and personal estate columns. You get a sense of who owned land and money and who had land and money. And that can also be indicative of former plantation holders, people who continue to own land, own a lot of land. And it asks about voting experience. The last question on the 1870 census asks if you're a man over 21, if you were denied the right to vote the last time you tried. So you can see the influence of Reconstruction and of the Freedmen's Bureau. We have an image from the Freedmen's Bureau here in that time frame. And it makes it a really, really interesting document, right? And really crucial, again, for seeing getting a little picture of what life was like in those 5 years right after emancipation. So for the 1850 and 1860 federal censuses, we note that race is not often listed unless the person is a free Black person. This is the first census, these are the first censuses that you'll get that look familiar to us that have been doing genealogy research, and the ones before that. You have the long censuses where it lists the names and you have to scroll way over. But the 1850 also marks, again, the first time when all the household members are listed, and asks if a person is married within the last year. And so you can see to the right, I have highlighted here where all of the column about races. This is an 1860 census for a town called Columbia in Fluvanna, Virginia. And it lists, there was a sizable free Black population there. So if you look at this census record in column 6, you can see a fair number of B's and M's, and see that there was a sizable population of free Black people. And so in the US federal census for 1840 through 1790, we have the names of free Black heads of household, the number of free Black people by age and gender, and as well as identifying people who are receiving a military pension. So here I have a picture of an 1820 census for a man named Jesse Wood. He only has marks in the column where it is for free people of color. So you can see all of these others. The first page is going to be for white men and white women and white children, and then the first part of the second page is for enslaved people, and then those last columns are for free people of color. So it's difficult to read, but it does give us a lot of information too about the demographics of the area if we know what the columns stand for when you just look at the page as well.
Right. So as we head further into the antebellum period, we would like to highlight the 1850 and the 1860 slave schedule. So there were two. One of the most important aspects in using the 1850 and 1860 slave schedule is trying to identify who the slave owner is. When we often do searches in the center and now online virtually through our individual sessions, when we're showing these schedules for the first time, usually one of the first comments we get are, but it doesn't list the enslaved persons. So unfortunately, most schedules don't list the name of the enslaved people, but it still has really great information. And so the major categories in the 1850 and 1860 slave schedules includes the name of the slave owner. And as you track that slave owner's name, the line that that person appears on, the columns over begin the information for that slave owner's first enslaved person. And so you'll find that person's age, gender, and then race. Usually you'll see the person either listed as B for Black or M or MU for mulatto. In addition to that, the other categories are fugitive. Did this person actually escape in the last calendar year? Also, the number of enslaved people manumitted. Did this slave owner manumit anyone? And then the last column lists disability. And the terms that were used at that time listed disability as deaf, dumb, blind, insane, and idiotic. And so again, we have to think back to that time period. That's the kind of terminology that you would find at that time, but you will also see those same terms repeated on other schedules regarding physical and mental disability. So again, the important thing about the 1850 and 60 slave schedules is one of the most important tools that will hopefully help us break that 1870 brick wall. Many of us get to 1870, and if you don't continue to see your family members listed on earlier censuses, then you'll have to come up with research strategies to try to identify who the potential slave owner is. And that's what we're going to look into next. When you think about the slave schedules, though, there are actually some exceptions. So far to date, there are at least 3 counties where the census enumerators did actually list the names of the enslaved people. And so those counties so far are Scott County, Kentucky for 1850, Camden County, North Carolina for 1860, and Boyd County for Kentucky. And if you look at this particular slave schedule, we also know that on some of the slave schedules, they were asked to write the names of the oldest slaves. Most of them say if the enslaved person was at least 100, and then they would record that person's name. But in this particular slave schedule for Dallas County, Alabama, they actually listed the name of an enslaved person who was 75. And what's so fascinating, the person's name is called Old Dublin. He's listed as being free in 1850. And if you continue to follow him into the 1870 census, you'll find out that Dublin was actually born in Africa. He states that he was born there on the continent. And so again, we encourage you to use the slave schedules. Now, as we look further onto the next slide, we're going to talk about how do you actually locate the slave schedules. We've worked with many people, and some people don't even know about the slave schedules, or if they know about them, they don't know actually how to access them on the internet. or using the major databases that we use, which are FamilySearch and Ancestry. So this is Ancestry's main research page. And when you pull it up, if you look on the right-hand side under Research by Location, you're going to find a map of the world. And then under that, you'll see Find a Location. And Find a Location, you'll see a box. You'll want to type in United States. Once you type in United States, a drop box is going to appear, and it will list several record collections. And again, you want to focus on either the 1850 or 1860 slave schedule, and it will allow you to choose one of those. But again, you do have to get to this page and then put in United States and drop down on that box. That's one way of getting to the slave schedules on FamilySearch. And if we look at Ancestry, when you come to the main page on Ancestry on the right-hand side, you'll see the column for special collections. Under special collections, the second subheading that's highlighted says Census and Vote Lists. And then under that, the very bottom listing is for the US Federal Census collection. Once you hit that, you will get a page that will outline all of the US censuses from 1940 back to 1790, including all the schedules as well. So again, from that page, you'll be able to select either using the 1860 or the 1850 slave schedule. Now, so what research strategies do you use when using the slave schedules? One of the main research strategies we encourage people to use is see if your family or the family that you're researching, if they shared the same last name, okay, if there was a shared surname. It's not always the case, as we know in researching African-American enslaved genealogy, there is no one size fits all, but if that was the case, this technique may work. And so when you come to that slave schedule, under last name, you want to put that surname in, and then you'll want to put the county and the name of the state. Basically, that's all you need, just those three pieces of information, a possible shared surname, and then the county's name, and then the state. And that's what you can use for FamilySearch. If a match is made, if you do see slave owners in the return page that match that same surname, you'll then want to begin to research the slave owner's family between the same census year from 1790 up to 1870. You'll be conducting census researches of that slave owning family the same way you would conduct searches for your own family. And we're going to talk about that next. And so on this particular slide, we're showing an 1860 census record from Richmond County, Virginia. Richmond County is part of the northern neck of Virginia. When you use the slave schedule, you're going to want to use them in conjunction with either the 1870 census or the 1880 census. Some historians think there was an undercount on the 1870 census. So if you're not able to find the family you're looking for on 1870, try the 1880 census. This actual slide is a slide from my family. And so when I was looking for my second great grandfather, Joseph Crawley, for Richmond County, and specifically in 1870, the family was living in Warsaw, Virginia. He was listed with his wife, Rose, and then his son, Willie. As I looked further, just 2 houses away, there was a Frances Crawley listed. She's a white widow woman who's 65 years old, living with her daughter and brother-in-law and her other family members as well. And so right away, I'm thinking, does my Joseph have a connection to this Frances Crawley? So I'll need to take her back further, okay? So again, if you get to that 1870 or 1880 census page, you'll want to go back at least 10 or 15 households. You'll want to go back and you'll want to go forward to see if you see any white or African-American families with the same last name. And so as I continued to look for Frances Crawley, I took her back to the 1860 census. I happened to find her still as a widow, listed with her children. Then I took her back to 1850, finally finding her with her husband, Samuel. When I looked at his slave schedule for 1850, what did I find? I found he owned 9 slaves, including 2 males who were around age 20. When I look at the demographics for my second great-grandfather, Joseph, I deduced that my Joseph may be one of these 20-year-old male enslaved men on this list. And then I continued to conduct research on Samuel Crawley. Now, as it happened, one of the white descendants of Samuel Crawley has an extensive family history page. I was very lucky to find this. I do need to confirm his information, but he actually continued to take the family back another 4 generations. What I learned regarding Samuel Crawley was his father was also named Samuel Crawley, and that he died in the northern neck of Virginia around 1833. And when he died, there was an inventory done of his property. When I also looked at the Crawley family, I found information on them, though, not just in Richmond County, but in Northumberland County, Westmoreland County, and a couple different counties across the northern neck. So again, when you're doing slave era research, you want to do regional research. Don't just stick to one county. Think of what other places these families may have owned land and property. And when I did that on this 1830 property inventory, in the left-hand column at the bottom starts the name of the enslaved people. They started with the adult enslaved people who were listed with the highest property values, and then they listed everyone else next. At the top of the right-hand column, it continued with some adults, including some couples, and then right under that, there were names of people who were described as boys and girls. And then under that, there were a couple of more names, including a Joe. And so I believe that this Joe is probably more like a baby or toddler. He's not described as an adult or a girl or boy, and so he is likely probably a child or baby. And then underneath him, there was a person described as an old slave woman, and then it gave her name. And so again, when I looked at all this information, I also happened to find a Freedmen's Bureau record on the family. I am deducing, and again, I'm continuing to do research, but so far it's pointing me in this direction. And I do believe that I may have found my second great-grandfather, Joseph Crawley, on this slave inventory for 1833. When we look at the migration of enslaved people and enslaved holders, we want to talk about how can we use the slave schedule to track them. So the example that I give, I state here at the bottom of this slide. Joe Talbot is born enslaved in Virginia in 1840, and in 1870, he's living in Warren County, Tennessee. So what do I want to do? I want to research any Talbot slaveholders for the 1860 and 1850 slave schedule. And I want to see if there are any with that same last name, as well as any that were born in Virginia. I may find hits with those if I happen to find those with the same shared last name, or I may not find any with the shared last name, but find slaveholders though who were living in Warren County in 1850 and 1860 and were also from Virginia. So that could also give me a hint as to who Joe Talbot's slave owner might have been. And before we go on to the next slide, one other thing I did want to mention, we do the flip side of this research. So what do I mean when I say that? We have had people visit the Family History Center at the museum who are the descendants of slave owners, who are the white descendants of slave owners. And so they have also asked us, can you show us how to use the slave schedule? Two stories I'd like to just share briefly. There was a woman who came in. She mentioned she had a diary in her family that was passed down to her, and it talked about the slaves that her family owned in Virginia. She had never used the slave schedule. And again, when we used it, we did find her family member listed with slaves. And so that helped her make sense of the people who were listed in this family diary. We've also done searches. I recall in particular doing a session with a young lady whose family was from Louisiana and Texas. We got the family back to like the mid 1800s. And I just asked her off the top of my head, I said, since we're back this far in Louisiana and Texas, do you want to see if your family owned any slaves? And she thought about it for a moment, and then she said yes. And when we looked further, we also found that her family owned enslaved people. So it's just been really interesting at this time in history, doing this research from both sides of the coin for African-American families, for our own African-American families, and then also for white families who are the descendants of slaveholders. So it's been very interesting. There's also another possibility of finding your enslaved ancestors, and that is using the mortality schedule. There are at least 4 mortality slave schedules, or I should say mortality schedules. There are mortality schedules during the antebellum period for 1850 and 1860, and there are 2 others after emancipation, 1870 and 1880. But we do know that some counties did include the names of enslaved people who died in 1849. And there is a column for free and enslaved people there. And again, the general columns on this mortality schedule are age, sex, race, their status, free or slave, the marital status, the person's occupation, the length of residence for that particular county, the month that the person died, the cause of death, and if there was an attending physician, and that person's name. One of the innovations from the slave schedules, ironically, was the creation of population density maps. After the 1860 slave schedule and census was compiled by the US Census Bureau, they created their first population density map. And it specifically was called the map showing the distribution of the slave population of the Southern United States. And so if you look at the map, the darker areas indicate larger enslaved populations. And so again, you'll find the Deep South with the largest amounts of enslaved populations. In the lighter areas, you're going to find larger numbers of white people and free Blacks. From this census, 10 years later, the Census Bureau began creating just general population density maps. But ironically, the very first one came out of the 1860 slave schedule. This map was also sold, and the money was used to assist sick and wounded soldiers.
So we're going to shift back to the 20th century now and talk a bit about some 20th century censuses and post-emancipation censuses. So we want to pay attention to what the enumerator is trying to say. So federal marshals and their assistants were the first census enumerators. And then by 1879, so 110 years after the first census almost, the government began requiring training of the enumerators for each of the federal censuses. We recommend taking your time to see how everyone is listed and what that could possibly say about the makeup of the family and the structure of the family, because sometimes the enumerator will slip some hints in there for us. So this example here, we have the Rouse family in Lenoir County, North Carolina. At this point, they're living in Moseley Hall, 1920. And it is difficult to see, but here we have the head of the household, and then we have his children listed. We have a son, a daughter, a son and 3 daughters, and then after that we have his wife listed. And that's not typically the order. We usually see the head of the household and then their spouse. But because this has the wife listed after the 4 children, we can deduce, and then there are more children listed after the wife's name, we can deduce that he may have had a first marriage and that there's a first set of children coming from that marriage. These children are older, they tend to be older. His wife is 17 and the oldest child that he has in this household is 19. But then they're mostly teenagers from there. And then the younger children are listed here as 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2. So based on a biological reality and the way this is listed, we can deduce again that this person, Wright Rouse, was likely married, but that Rosanna was married twice, and that Rosanna, his second wife, is the one who is the mother of his younger children. And we're going to use this family once again. We have them actually listed twice. They're listed in this census, in the 19th census, twice. And so we see them in the same county, about a month apart, living in 2 different parts of the county. So the first one, they were living in Moseley Hall. Right now they're living in Institute. And it is the same family, the same names are all listed here, and not the exact same ages, but really close ages, but the names and the last name are not very common, and they're all together similarly as in the first one. So it may indicate that they made a local move. And so if you see a family listed twice, but in slightly different areas, you would definitely want to check the date on the census, when the census was taken. And this is true if you see one person listed twice. If you see someone of the same, that is your family member, let's say you're looking and you see them twice, you maybe see them in a house where they're listed as the grandchild, and the next house they're listed as the child. And it's the same person, or you can tell it's the same person by their age and the other factors, their name, how old they are, etc., where their parents were born. It tells us something about the community, about people's movements in time, in that point in time, and what they were doing and what their lives may have looked like. So we also have, in this next census, we have looking at the families who are living next door. And so we're talking about, this is the Williams family, and they're in Ohio. And we searched for Nelson, who is outlined in black here. He's listed as being 3 years old. All of his parents were born in Ohio. We found him living with his parents in this census. It's the 1910 census. And his parents are William and Clara. And then we looked right next door and we have another Nelson Williams who's listed as being 75. And we can tell and deduce by the names that this is the next generation, the prior generation. The Nelson Williams Sr. is also listed as being born in Virginia, and he's eventually found on an 1880 and 1870 census in northern Cuyahoga County. And Lisa will share more about them. You're on mute, Lisa.
Yep. And so when we continue to actually look at this particular community, Eagle Township, which is located in Brown County, it has a really interesting history. And we always tell people it is never too early to start researching the local history particularly when you see that your family is living in the same region or in the same county. So when we looked at Brown County, the history of it is that it was settled actually early on by free Blacks who had migrated from Virginia in 1818. They were owned by a slave owner by the name of Samuel Gist. He had various plantations in central Virginia, and he manumitted them early on. So he manumitted about, well, actually, like over 350 people, but 350 of the people who he manumitted journeyed to Ohio, where he bought property and where they eventually settled. And so this particular community has a really interesting history. So when we happen to do this individual genealogy session with a member of the Williams family, we are still trying to see if Nelson Williams, who says he was from Virginia and lived in Eagle Township, if perhaps he was manumitted also by Samuel Gist and is part of the history of this community. We also happen to find another interesting record on that Nelson, who was 75 years old, the father of William living next door. He was a Civil War soldier, and we found a Civil War record for him for the 73rd U.S. Colored Infantry Company G. And again, when we look at the history of Eagle Township, they had a large number of their African-American men who served during the Civil War and served for that same infantry. So again, as you start researching, it is never too early to start looking at the local history of free and enslaved people in a particular county.
So here we also talk about using the fan club, family, associates, and neighbors. We see that Jake Holt Jr. was born, or we know that Jake Holt Jr. was born in Talbotton, Georgia, and found in the census record with the last name of Holt. We don't have that pictured, but we did see this. And as a youth, he's listed as Jake Wamble, with his mother Mary or Mariah Wamble and an older brother named Riley. And although oral history identifies Jake's father as Jake Holt as also being Jake Holt, it was confirmed by searching through the records for his brother Riley's wedding in Alabama. So we know that we can't always find every record on every person to confirm every piece of information. It's crucial that we do use information about neighbors, about family members who live nearby, and about people that we know are connected to our relatives or whoever the person is that we're searching for, to gather more information about the people that we're directly searching for. So you see here, we have the marriage record for Riley Holt transcribed. It lists that he was born in 1884. This is a record from 1947, but it lists his father as Jake Holt and his mother as being Maria Wamble. So that helps us to reference this oral history that we have about this person, as well as provide some documentary evidence as well. So we also want to talk about different strategies for searching for people in the census when we can't necessarily find them just by doing running a typical search. So we can use a wildcard search to search for them. We can select a specific census and eliminate either the first or last name. So you can see pictured. This is if we're looking for Hortense Finley. So we have the 1880 federal census here, just searching for that one. We have the places that we're searching her, the residence, her estimated birth year, and then we would hit search. It would kick back all of the people that matched that surname, and we can search for a Hortense. We know that there are many spelling errors and transcription errors when it comes to the census, and using this method and being flexible with spellings, with estimated birth years, can be really helpful in locating records for family members. For us, I actually just did this yesterday and found a 3 times great-grandfather because I just searched for his last name in the area where he lived. And if you're using FamilySearch, select residence as the primary location and then leave the birthplace blank so it doesn't try to search for too many things at one time, and you can at least eliminate the birthplace and just be searching that one area.
And finally, as we draw towards the end of the of this presentation, some people assume that if they're getting a lot of hits on FamilySearch or either Ancestry, if they're finding a lot of vital records, they're assuming like all the vital records are online. So FamilySearch and Ancestry only have lots of records, but they only have those vital records that those states enable them to have. And so if you're looking for a vital record for your family member and you can't find it, if you Google this page, it will tell you where you can find that vital record. So for each state, it outlines where you can find the birth, marriage, and death records. It also outlines when those records began per state. So when you look back in American history, most vital records really were not uniform until the 1900s. And we also know, obviously, right, that all along the East Coast has the oldest states and the colonies, et cetera. East Coast will tend to have older records. But again, most vital records were not uniform until the early 1900s. We start to see some around 1906, 1907. For other states, we won't see them until 1913, 1914, 1915. So it all depends. But again, if you can't find it online, then you will have to contact the Vital Records Office in your county. And this website will actually give you that information. Oftentimes in the state, for instance, like in Maryland, you may have to go to the county for that particular record. And then for, say, a record before 1900, you may have to go to Annapolis to the state archives. Many states are kind of mixed like that, where there's a particular date where the county will have it. And then if it's a real early date, you'll have to go to the archives. So again, you'll just want to pay attention to the fluctuation in dates. And as you begin to move past databases, right, we always tell people, look at your genealogy research like you're putting together a really good term paper. You want to use as many sources as possible. You don't want to stay on the same database. People have said, well, what's the gold standard? Isn't Ancestry the gold standard? Okay, Ancestry does have more records than any other commercial database, but you may find something on FamilySearch that you didn't find on Ancestry. But you'll want to expand beyond that. Since we've been doing the virtual sessions, we've been able to use a lot of maps, which is really helpful. As you start finding your family on the census, look at where they live and what the surrounding counties are around them, and then start tracking their migration. If they happen to move from Virginia up to New York, from Mississippi up to Chicago, start looking at those maps. You can begin to do newspaper research. Most public libraries have access to ProQuest, and there you'll find your regular county and city local newspapers, but you'll also find historic Black newspapers like Norfolk's Journal and Guide, like the Baltimore Afro-American, like the Amsterdam News out of Harlem. So you can, access all kinds of different tools. And again, I always say, once you get back to 1870 and the 1800s, people, you really should start digging deep into your local and state research. These are some of the resources that we use, and there's certainly others. One of the helpful tools that we found is through the decades. That will give you a really nice history of the US Census. Another was that getting ready for the 1950 census. And again, these are some of the sources that we think that will help you. It will also define all the different categories for each census. We have an upcoming program. Actually, Hannah, can you share this?
Yeah, I can share it.
Yes.
So our upcoming program, it is in 2.5 weeks.
Yeah.
This is the African Burial Grounds 30 years later, the impacts on Black cemeteries. It'll be on Saturday, May 8th from 12 to 1:30 Eastern. And we'll have Dr. William & Mary's own, Dr. Michael Blakey, along with Peggy King-Yorta and Dr. Joseph Jones, discussing the impacts on Black cemeteries of the African burial grounds and the research that came out of that project. So we're really excited. It should be a really great lecture and conversation, and we hope that you'll join us. And you can register on the museum's website. So if you even just Google NMAHC events, it'll take you to the events page, and there's a link to register there.
And our next program with you, we are looking forward to June 15th, and that topic is going to be genealogy and records of intrigue. One of the stories that we're going to bring to you comes from the Freedmen's Bank records, and it's an Upper South story of a enslaved spinner and weaver, and we are looking forward to sharing how we used reverse genealogy in tracing a family from the Upper South. And that will be on June 15th.
And we thank you so much for being here. And if you're interested in an individual session with us, you can email us at familyhistorycenter@si.edu, and we can put the link in the chat. And thanks again.
Great. Thank you, Hannah and Lisa, for joining us. This has been absolutely great. So much information. I've been taking a lot of notes here. And I'm quite sure the guests have as well. And we have 3 questions here. And feel free to the audience members, feel free to type in your questions in the chat. Also feel free to give a virtual applause. We have some thank yous here in the chat of people who are appreciating your presentation. The first question I have is, since the 1890 census was destroyed, do you have any recommendations for other sources to search through for information on families around that time?
Yeah, so there are some state censuses that were taken in both 1885 and 1895 that can help fill in some of the gaps. That is not every state, unfortunately, but it is some states. We also recommend local records, vital records, where they're available. Again, they don't start to be super standardized until the early 20th century, but where they are standardized, or where they are common, I should say, they can be helpful as well. Lisa, did you have any other ones that you wanted to mention?
That's probably it. But you know, that can be a hard jump, because with that missing record collection, you're having to jump back 20 years. And you know, we find some families it's easier to do than others. If the family has a good oral history, that helps, or Bible records or something else that will fill in. But for some families, you can kind of get stuck there, and you know, so it's that can be like the first brick wall that people get to. So it happens.
Right. Okay. Thank you all for that. We have another question. This person states, I'm a descendant of many enslavers in Virginia. I have researched their slaves, finding them named in wills of the 18th century. Slave schedules of the 19th century have not yielded much information I can connect. I do not find wills from the 19th century on Ancestry or other sources. Any suggestions?
Go ahead, Lisa.
You want to say, okay.
You could go.
That is a hard one, because then the question becomes also, how long did that family own slaves, and what last name did those people take at that time? What you can start to do, you can start researching the people who they acquired their slaves from, to see if you can capture any history and try to bring them forward. You can look and see if any families in that local area took that same last name. Do you have any other? Do you have any other?
I guess it just depends on when the wills are from. Because if you have wills that are going to be from the 1860s and the 1850s, you may be able to locate some people in the 1870 census, depending on their ages and their first names and the location. But if it's from like the 1820s, that still could be the case. The people would be older at that point. So it depends on the time frame, and then the ages of the people listed. And then I think Lisa was mentioning local history, local resources are crucial. A lot of historical societies have a lot of information about families, and they're in some places, I know in Virginia specifically, but throughout the South, there are places where people haven't moved from living there since emancipation. So connecting to some of those local families, learning the local history of the families that have been there for a long time, both Black and white, can open up a lot of doors.
Yeah, but I know it's going to be hard making that jump, but if they took that slave owner's last name, even just doing some cursory searches of finding, looking for any Black Civil War soldiers with the same last name, with the shared last name coming from the same place, any Freedmen's Bureau records of people with the same last name, but that is going to be a hard one. Yeah, it's going to be hard to bring forward. And again, you may want to look in oral history collections. What are the oral history collections in that area? What, particularly among the Black families, and see what you find.
And the WPA areas can be helpful too.
Yeah. It's interesting because we've met, so many Black families where a number of them, not a whole lot, but when they have a strong oral history and they will say, well, we know we came from the plantation of so-and-so, and they will identify who that plantation owner is. It's not always a shared last name, it just depends. But yeah, so I mean, you just have to look, you have to make your search broader in that sense as opposed to narrower.
Yeah, regarding in that case study you presented of the families in Virginia that migrated to Ohio, because I'm now looking at in Virginia, I think about 1810, there were about 30,000 free persons, and I think some of that kind of connects with the surplus of enslaved persons during that particular time. But I wanted to know, why were they going to Ohio? What was the reason for migration? I'm quite sure it was related to labor in some way, but I wanted a bit more insight, particularly not just on this case, but kind of writ large. Why were they going in that state in particular?
We actually have been talking about this lately ourselves, and it seems to be a pattern that is a place where people went. We don't know exactly why, but in Central Virginia, this is the case, that a lot of people settled in Ohio. But I was just told, and I was going to tell Lisa about this, and it's called Ohio Black Settlements, is a book that came out, I think, I don't have the actual date for that, but that it tells about the settlements from Virginia, and about slave owners or enslavers manumitting hundreds of people at a time. And then they settle in Ohio. I know also Brown Township, which we talked about, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. It's right on the border of the river, the Ohio River. So that was a destination, but that's not necessarily the same or an overlap of the people who are coming from Virginia. But Ohio Black Settlements, a genealogy book that I was also just recommended. So definitely check it out if you're interested in learning more.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, thank you. I think we have one last question. I think we have a little time, another minute. Says, have you experienced with DNA testing and finding ancestors? Has that been of any help to you in helping others, I guess, in your own research?
So we have done programs on DNA. I've taken several DNA tests. That's not my area of concentration, and it is its own thing. And so whenever I get really intermediate and deep DNA questions, I always refer them to my colleagues who are DNA specialists. But the main thing I tell people is when you're first starting, right, think about what is it that you're trying to find out. If you're doing and just to educate yourself on the basics, a maternal test will give you information specifically on your mother's line. A paternal test, your father's line. So when you do this, you want to pick the right person, depending on, sometimes we do this and we're actually researching our mother's father's side or our father's mother's side. So you have to make sure to pick the right person. The autosomal tests are always interesting because that will give you your ethnic breakdown. One of the main latest books about DNA is by Blaine Bettinger, and we can forward this to you. It's BLAINE BETTINGER. He's written one of the latest books regarding DNA. And then, we tell people if you want a more in-depth result of your DNA tests, you'll want to combine them and do like a GEDCOM search, where that will, is GEDCOM or GEDmatch? I'm always using the wrong terminology, but I think it's GEDmatch. And that will give you a more sophisticated answer, or I should say profile, a more sophisticated DNA profile for that line. It will break down your haplogroup and give you more specific information based on shared centimorgans of, from your test. But it's always interesting, to do that research, but also we always encourage people still do your genealogy record research, because it all goes back to, what county and state your family came to, and how long your family goes back into that state, and what people from West Africa came to that state. So who were the Africans who came to Virginia? Who were the Africans who came to North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. Now, I also want to say that we will be going a bit more in depth in that topic this summer we actually have 3 workshops, and our friends who will be participating with us, we're having what we call a Summer Sankofa series, which is a Lemon Project genealogy workshop series that we're doing over the summer. And there's a link in the chat that gives you those details. But Lisa and Hannah will be back to, as they mentioned, to do a workshop on records of intrigue. We also have Renata Yarbrough-Saunders, who will be doing a session on researching enslaved people of color. And she's also an expert in the area of DNA as well. Also, we have our oral historian here at William & Mary, Andre Taylor, who will be doing a workshop on oral history for the family historian. So we have some wonderful programs lined up for you. And want to once again, thank you to Hannah, thank you to Lisa for your the information you provided this evening. I think we all have taken something away from it. Thank you to those who have joined us on this evening. And again, stay tuned to our programming. Follow us on our social media platforms. And we look forward to seeing you in our next workshop. Have a great evening.